Hi, guys. As we start talking about space exploration, I just wanted to kind of review that our study of space has been going on forever. We talked about how our understanding of the structure of our solar system even has changed dramatically over time. We used to think it was a geocentric view, where the Earth was in the center, and that changed to our understanding that all of the planets orbit around the sun, and that changed to our understanding that the sun is just one of billions of stars in a galaxy, and our galaxy is one of billions of galaxies. Okay, so I don't want to put a start time on space exploration, but the day that it really changed from observing space from Earth to actually going into space or sending things out into space was in 1957. And so we're kind of fast forwarding up into 1957. And this date right here, October 4th, 1957, is what kicks off what we now know as the space race. The space race was a competition between the United States and the Soviets to land a man on the moon and then have him come home safely. So in 1957, October 4th, 1957, the Soviets launched this satellite. This satellite is called Sputnik 1, and it gets launched into orbit around the Earth and is sending back a radio transmission that makes a little beeping sound, so people could actually watch the light go across in the sky and listen to the beeping of Sputnik for about 3 weeks until the batteries died on it and you couldn't hear it anymore. And it continued to orbit for another couple months. In total, Sputnik orbited Earth 1,440 times. And that was the first time. That was the first thing that was a man-made object that was launched from Earth out into space. And it was a really big deal, and that kicked off this competition. All right, so a month later after that launch, the Soviets did it again. They launched Sputnik 2 carrying a dog, Laika, into space, and that was the first living organism to go into space. Okay, so after these two events, the United States and President Eisenhower organized the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, to allow us to get federal funding to actually be competitors in this race to the moon. And so with NASA organized, we were able to kind of answer back. And in this time of the 60s, it was a back and forth between the Soviets and the United States. They would launch something, we would launch something. They would launch something to hard land on the moon, we would launch something to hard land on the moon. We would launch something to soft land on the moon, they would launch something to soft land on the moon. And all of these different missions were in an effort to make the ultimate goal, which is to get a human on the moon. Okay, so 1959, the Soviets launched Luna 1, which was the first thing that was supposed to hard land on the moon, which is a nice way of saying crash into the moon. And it actually missed its target. This craft is still orbiting around the sun between the orbits of Mars and Earth. So that was not successful. We answered back with the Explorer 6, which is the first weather satellite, and we get back some pictures of Earth from space. Those were our first pictures of Earth from space. Then the Soviets launched Luna 2, and that actually made it to the moon. It completed the mission that Luna 1 was supposed to do. They launched Luna 3, which sends back photographs of the far side of the moon. In 1960, they launched Sputnik 5, which 2 more dogs go up into space, and these 2 come home safe. That was good. 1961, we answered back by sending up Ham. Not actual Ham. Ham was the name of a chimpanzee, an American chimpanzee. He goes off into space and returns successfully. And then this is another really, really big deal. Okay, so 1957 was the first object in space. Now 1961 is the first human in space. Yuri Gagarin is a Soviet that goes up on the Vostok 1, and this is a huge milestone. He becomes the first human to go into space and make it back safely. Okay, so we answer back a month later with our American astronaut, Alan Shepard, and he takes he does not actually go into orbit. He just takes a high flight of 116 miles, takes a flight for about 15 minutes. Our first American to actually orbit Earth is John Glenn, and that came just after this one. 1963, Valentina Tereshkova is the first woman to go to space. She spends almost 3 days orbiting the Earth 48 times aboard the Vostok 6. Another big milestone was in March of 1965. Alexei Leonov actually does the first spacewalk. So what that means is there's a human up in space and they actually leave their craft and they're tethered to their craft, but they go out and float around in space. And these are all very important studies to prepare us to get to the moon, obviously. The humans are going to have to leave the craft in order to walk on the moon. So this was all experimental, and another really courageous man here, leaving his spacecraft, pushing off there, and if he lets go, you can see him go float away with his little tether. There he is, and he's just floating around. So he's the first guy to do that. 1967. Actually, let me back up. Before 1967, in the midst of the 60s, the United States was undergoing all of the Gemini missions, and the Gemini missions aren't mentioned nearly as much as the Apollo missions, but they were really, really important in getting us to the moon. The Gemini missions were a series of missions that studied a lot of the effects of space on humans. So we would go up into space and we'd hang out for a while and then we'd come home. We would go into space, we would leave the craft and do a spacewalk and we'd come home. We'd go into space and we would take a command module and a lunar lander and we would detach them and reattach them and then come home. All of those kinds of docking things, all of those practice things were all done in the Gemini missions. It was really the bridge between unmanned satellites and actually making it to the moon. And so our really successful Gemini mission really kind of catapulted us ahead into the Apollo missions. And our Apollo missions didn't start out so good. 1967 was Apollo 1 saw our first American casualties in space exploration. It was a bad year for both us and the Soviets. Apollo 1 astronauts Ed White, Gus Grissom, and Roger Chaffee die when a fire ignited in the Apollo 1 capsule on the launch pad. So a fire broke out and they couldn't get the hatch open, and so all 3 astronauts died on board. And that was a really big bump in the road for the Apollo missions. That was the first of the Apollos, and we started off with 3 casualties. So it was a really tough thing to overcome, and not just kind of throw in the towel, right? But we did. And in 1968, we sent up Apollo 8, and that was the first human crewed spacecraft to actually reach the moon, orbit it, and then return successfully to Earth. So they didn't get out and walk on it, but it was as close as we had gotten so far. Okay, then the really big deal, maybe the most famous of all space exploration, was July 20th, 1969. And that was where Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin became the first 2 men to walk on the moon, while their crewmate Michael Collins hung out in the command module. He drove them there, right? They detached the lunar lander, went down, landed on the moon, walked around, got back in the lunar lander, blasted off from the moon, reattached to Michael Collins, and they came home. And that was viewed worldwide. Millions of people tuned into that to see the first humans walk on an extraterrestrial surface. It was a really, really big deal and still is today. And that kind of marked the end of the space race between the Soviets and the United States. And you'll see in later lectures about space exploration, I'll talk about what happened in the 70s and 80s and what we're up to now. Um, but after this space race, after we made it to the moon, things became largely cooperative between nations. It became much more of an international effort to explore space, and it wasn't a competition between the two. So you'll see a lot of that change. You'll see a lot of collaboration and sending up different things from different countries and rendezvousing and meeting up in space and um, in preparation for making the International Space Station and all of those other things. But that's the first of a few lectures. We'll talk about the 70s and 80s next. I hope you are all well.